I'm a white woman.
Mm-hmm.
White women have been very problematic historically, and especially in the last few years, there have been story after story of the ways that people who look like me show up in problematic ways. And so recognizing that, reckoning with my own privilege in the midst of that.
I'm Geremy Dixon, and you're listening to the Misfit Manifesto. What's up, party people, and welcome back to Misfit Manifesto. So on today's episode, we sit down with Cassie Trentaz, full professor of theology, ethics, and church history at Warner Pacific University. A low-key rascal committed to inching, stumbling, and leaping toward glimpses of shalom in the world today, following the lead of those often excluded. Cassie and I will discuss the two loops theory of change, collapsing of culture, and drawing on history to prepare us for tomorrow. Cassie Trentaz, I can't tell you how happy I am to have you on the show.
Oh my goodness, Geremy, it's so good to be here. I wish I was with you in studio.
Yeah.
It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Means the world to me. I mean, obviously, one of the things that I've been super excited about is that all of my guests are people who I actually talk to regularly, and I don't know if that's always gonna be the case. But right now in this first season, I've been able to draw upon the fact that, the rapport or the energy we have, the chemistry we have, like in this space, is because we have a real relationship. And so much of, I think, the work that I do and the ways in which I'm showing up in the world really is informed by my relationships. And I can't, and maybe you know this, but I can't tell you how much you are a big part of kind of the way in which I'm showing up in the world. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Geremy. And I'm glad that you named those things, because that's a lot of the heartbeat of some of the questions that I think that you have for me and some of the topics that we're going to be talking about.
Absolutely. So here's what's funny is that as much as we spend time together in Oregon, in Indiana, wherever we've been in LA, I don't actually know much about your upbringing. So I think just for context, and I'm going to get into some heavy stuff in a minute, but for context, it might be cool to kind of just hear about, like, what's the origin story? Like, you're a superhero, but we want to know what the origin story is. Like, where do you come from? City, state, mom, dad? Like, who is Cassie? How do you arrive at this moment?
Yeah. And I wouldn't say superhero. We're on a Misfits podcast, right? So
right.
Maybe
Absolutely.
Spin is the anti-hero at times.
Yep.
My roots. You're asking about my roots.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I grew up in Kansas, in a little town in Kansas, a little farm community, with a family of farmers and teachers and storytellers and pranksters. My parents were both public school teachers.
Oh, cool.
And my dad also was in the National Guard. So grew up with a little bit of a military family. And folks who have been in Kansas for a long time. So people who know how to be connected to the land, people who know how fragile life is. I think that was a lot of my own shaping, is just recognizing what it's like to be in wide open spaces, and also dependent on, like, the wildness of the weather. So there's a bit of a, who can you count on? You can count on your people, but you can't always count on, you got to be scrappy. You got to be problem solving. You got to be ready to hold some things loosely, and be grateful for what comes, and be ready to adapt when those things don't come. So that was a little bit of my upbringing. Moved from there to college in Indiana.
Okay.
So the experience of a more, like, blue collar factory town that experienced a lot of significant economic pressure about the time that I was arriving. And that also was the seat of my faith tradition. And then to the south side of Chicago, where we moved, and I did my graduate studies there and worked as a pastoral caregiver for an HIV and AIDS pastoral caregiving organization. And there just experienced the beauty and the power and the complication of that urban environment before moving out to Portland's Outer East Side here in Oregon 13 years ago, and became a parent like almost immediately after that. So that changed a little bit of my dynamics in the world as well.
That's incredible. It's so funny when and this is completely aside, when you were talking about just kind of the wide open space of your upbringing and the nature of being in spaces where you're kind of reliant on sometimes the unpredictable elements of the world and how it evolves. So I'm watching the show. First of all, I'm a Yellowstone fan, so I watched Yellowstone. and then I started watching, I think it's 1883. And then I started watching 1881. Now I'm watching 1923 or whatever it's called. All these spinoffs, right? And so there's this pretty crazy scene that I just watched recently. And in the scene, the short version is the Catholic Church, the nuns, are trying to convert these Native Americans, young women, right? And part of what happens is, and I'm going to get the language wrong, but ultimately, as they're trying to teach them farming, they say something to the effect of, we're going to kind of remove you from having to follow the migration of the wild and the unpredictable nature, and teach you how to create this space where it's more predictable. And I thought to myself, man, how it is to me a very conscious way of looking at sometimes how we move away from the fact that the unpredictable nature is actually something that we need. And we're so busy trying to make things predictable and trying to organize them. And actually it's kind of like antithetical to the way in which we ought to arrive in the world, like depending on God and not knowing all the answers and having to go with the flow. We want everything to be in boxes and shapes. And that's not really how we ought to show up. Not always.
Yeah, and that's antithetical, I think, to the way that the world often works.
Yeah.
So the more that we try to create that security or that predictability, there's gains in that for sure.
Absolutely.
And there's losses, and we don't always know, or we can't always predict.
Yeah.
Even in the midst of that, like what might be lost, what disconnections are created.
Yeah.
And then what, the next generation will have to adjust, or 100 years from now, the ways that might impact how our descendants kind of show up in the world.
Makes so much sense. All right, so we kind of heard this in your intro, but you are, gainfully employed as an incredible professor at Warner Pacific University. Mm-hmm. You are an ordained member of the clergy in the Church of God movement. And you also, in the past few years, cut your locks because of the tear gas, from your protesting. And so there's this unique intersection of higher education, your path in ordained ministry, and also like you're in the streets, dodging tear gas canisters, mask, mobilizing, checking your GPS on your phone to make sure you're not being tracked. Talk a little bit about how those three kind of work together.
You're trying to make my life make sense, huh?
Listen, I'm doing the best I can.
Make my life make sense, coming out with the heavy hitters. Yeah. How do these components of my identity and just how I show up in the world work together? Which to me feels really integrated. Yeah. Like they feel incredibly woven together and integrated. But I think I'll start with the faith tradition piece. Sure. As that's the piece that really kind of anchors and the rest, and weave intersections from there. Yeah. You mentioned I'm an ordained minister in the Church of God, which is a family branch of kind of the wider religious family of Christianity. I work in interfaith circles, so sometimes denominations make less sense than that bigger piece. Which is a broader religion that centers in the life and teachings of Jesus. Right? Jesus, the lower economic, colonized, Middle Eastern, Jewish man, as told in biblical narrative and throughout Christian history. So when I look to Jesus, everything centers on this concrete, practical love. Yeah. In and with actual people, right? So if you skinny the thing down, we often use the language of the great commandments to love God, self, neighbor, stranger, enemy, the world, and everything else hinges on that.
Yeah.
Right. So the Church of God piece is a particular people who focus on how do we live that love ethic through language we use of holiness and unity. And it's a particular kind of holiness. It's a Wesleyan holiness, which is a social holiness. So that's not a holiness that understands itself primarily as like separation from that which is we would call not holy, but understand itself as we actually become more holy when we become ever increasing full of love.
Yeah.
That love of God's self, neighbor, stranger, enemy, and the world.
Yeah.
And so full that there's no room for anything that doesn't look like love.
Yeah.
Right. But that social holiness piece is also really anchored in like understanding what life is like for the other. Understanding what life is like for real people. And especially when we think about Wesleyan holiness, there's a structural critique, there's a systemic critique, there's a paying attention to power, there's a paying attention to who are the folks who aren't benefiting from any given system, and saying what is the love of God, and where do we think Jesus might be in the midst of these kinds of systems. So that really is kind of an anchor for me. It's a love ethic that isn't like a fuzzy, feel-good, lovey-dovey,
right?
But there's a bite to it. There's some teeth to it. Sometimes there's an edge to it, and that's also the heart of my reality as both an educator and then a community organizer. So you're asking about kind of those three intersections.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of my life and how that shows up, and so understanding like love ethic that way pushes me to be and do better. But it also, in some ways, is fuel to be in those spaces, to be pushing us to be and do better, and be hearing from folks in those moments where like our flashpoints or pressure cake kind of moments where pressures and tensions are really, really live, to listen deeply to that and say, oh, what does it look like to show up here? What is love requiring here, asking for here? And so I can't be a teacher without being connected to the realities of the lives of my students.
Yeah.
And I can't be a community organizer, of course, without listening deeply and following the lead of what is going on in my particular local context. And so this is what leads me to the streets, right? You're asking about particularly the racial justice uprisings of 2020.
Yeah.
But as the fruit of like years of being an organizer and working in organizing communities and activist work as kind of the fruit of both faith and being a responsible educator. And many of my students are students of color, and they're impacted, they're feeling the impact, they're in the streets, and I can't be a clergy with any sense of integrity. I didn't feel like I could be an educator with a deep sense of integrity if I also wasn't there to at least be in my body, present, support, witness, observer to truth.
Yeah.
In some ways, like there to help when folks are getting kettled. Where are the pathways, where are the exits, and thinking about the role of just telling the story as it's really being experienced by folks and not just as other angles and narratives are telling. So I couldn't sit it out and wouldn't have chosen to sit it out. But it also meant that I had to continue to reckon with my own privilege. I'm a white woman. White women have been very problematic historically, and especially in the last few years, there have been story after story of the ways that people who look like me show up in problematic ways. And so recognizing that, reckoning with my own privilege in the midst of that. And so to my hair. Yeah. I had dreadlocks for 13 years. My lock journey started when I was living in Chicago, and in the community there in many ways was woven into those locks, gifted me the locks, the responsibility of that, recognizing both privilege and connection and feeling a sense of bearing one another's burdens. But I'm not living in Chicago anymore. And I'm away from that community. And being in Portland, a white woman with dreadlocks, was becoming more potentially problematic than helpful in the justice work and in supporting the work. So those seeds were already there. The core reason to begin to start combing those locks out, and then the experience of the pepper balls and the tear gas, when it was my turn in the streets, just confirmed the decision to comb those out. So I combed them out on that summer of 2020.
Yeah. I mean, I think it goes without saying that Portland was in some ways the epicenter of protests. I mean, Portland, y'all turned up in a major way following the George Floyd incident, the response to that. What would you attribute that to? Why did that experience have such impact in the Portland area?
There are a lot of dynamics that are unique in Portland. And though Portland was not unique in the sense that regular protests broke out, it became unique in how many consecutive days.
Yeah, how long it went.
So I think part of that was due to the longer history of mutual aid organizations that has been a part of Portland cultural history and Portland activist history. And Portland out here is known to be kind of on the left and stand for some things that were also woven into the dynamics around not just racial justice, but also how that intersects with policing.
Yeah.
It made it easier, I think, for folks to circle up, support each other, be able to spread out and sustain presence every night for all the nights. And a lot of different groups came together in that kind of way, so that it wasn't always the same people.
Got it.
And it wasn't always the same people having to sustain or supply the energy or care for each other in the same kinds of way every night. So there was a little bit of tagging back and forth, but there are a lot of folks who are way more in the center of it than I.
Sure.
And would give a much fuller response. But I think the mutual aid community, the kind of activist feel, the grassroots feel that's already a part of kind of Portland culture. And race dynamics have been a significant part of the history of Portland as a city. So there are communities feeling it and working in complicated ways to address that. That continue to unfold.
I think it's interesting, and we will touch on this a bit more in a moment, but just to, the thread of you call yourself a community organizer, which I think is absolutely appropriate. But what I hear you saying is, part of the capacity that you all had to sustain the level of protest over the period of time that you did was that there was this level in which the collaboration was highly organized on some level. There was this tagging, this interplay. There's several different groups able to interface with each other. And that's a huge part, this is called Misfits Manifesto. Sometimes the misfit motif is falsely interpreted as this aggressive individualism, but I highly disagree with that. I think, misfits know how to link up with other misfits and make incredible things happen. We're not anarchists, you know what I'm saying? We just don't choose to go along with the flow when we see opportunity. And so I think for you all there, no matter what anyone thinks about the protest, good, bad, or indifferent, you have to respect you all's capacity to organize well to sustain that type of protest for that prolonged period of time.
Yeah, and I would say, I participated with a group of interfaith clergy who we did not see our job in any way as the organizers of any of this. But our job is to support and to show up.
Yeah.
And to bring clergy presence.
Yeah.
and to follow the lead, particularly of our students, because so many of those who are really the heartbeat of this were young folks.
Yeah.
So what does it look like to just be present with the young folks, marching, come what may?
Yeah.
They can look over to us. We've got markers that indicate we are clergy. We've got our collars, or we've got our vests, sometimes vestments. And so that there's like a presence of like a sacred presence on the street in the midst of this. And also ability to there's someone here also who's bearing witness. So that there's a story to be told of the truth of the realities in the midst of this, in the folds of this, and the smoke, and the pepper of this, and not just removed. And that felt really crucial. So we're not the organizers. We're here to support.
Absolutely.
And bear witness in a moment that was really textured. And felt really sacred in that it was so powerful. That it was powerful.
You know, it's funny you mentioned that. I think about the apartheid movement. Like, I think most recognize that it was young people at the forefront. Like,
That's
you
right.
know, you travel there to South Africa, and you experience the museums and all the recollections of those experiences. Young kids were dying on those streets, you know, really at the forefront of that movement. And my sense is that when you look at this, you know, and I'm using so terribly, but like, I don't even know about anything about this band, but Rage Against the Machine, I'll just use that, right? When you see this rage against oppression, this rage against, you know, colonization, whatever, they're young minds, you know, vibrant, optimistic minds who are like championing the cause. And it's so great to have leadership, whether that's clergy or other types of leadership that help to undergird, give texture, give context, you know, add, you know, support, you know, safety as these folk kind of charge out in an attempt to see the world reflect what we see as our highest ideals. Yeah.
And I think what was important, and again, my role was very minimal.
Sure.
Right? We're there to show up. But to also be a presence that isn't saying, no, don't do it that way.
Right.
Or, but this is what worked for us. Or can't we all just this, right? There was a real intentional decision in the Portland protests and uprisings that multiple methods have to happen. And we're not going to regulate each other. That's huge. We're going to be present, and we'll be present through what unfolds. And we'll have some common mind and common goals, but not because we sat around the table and said, no, that goal is better than this goal, but allow those things to emerge out of the experiences of the people and the people with the most at stake, right? So that's the other thing, as you're talking about young folks who we want to have a longer future. So there's more at stake in the world that we're creating, in the world that they're kind of like pressing through and trying to help be born in a different way. So it feels like just like an honor and a joy. Though very painful. At times. And, you know, as an educator, as a parent, as a person of faith, as a white-skinned person in the United States. To kind of sort out what's responsibility, what's faithfulness look like here, and it still be made.
So I meet you, Cassie, you know, at the time you had locks, nose ring. I mean, you have this really eclectic kind of, this whole expression. I later find out that you were in a band. You give me one of your CDs, and in fact, I feel like my last car is probably the last car that allowed for disc to be put in. So I think your disc I turned it in. It might still be in the car actually. So I need another one. But I had it on in my car on repeat. You know, you're an incredible musician, and I mentioned earlier, you know, you're an active. You're so many things are happening. The question I have for you is, do you consider yourself to be a misfit? And if so, how would you define that? And is that intentional?
Those are good questions. I'm in a cover band now again.
No way.
So that's new information.
Wait, time out. That's new information. Is that an exclusive?
That's new.
Okay. Producers, come on, when we get exclusive, We get an exclusive. You heard it here first. Cassie Trentaz, cover band. All right, back on you.
Cover band. We'll call it an exclusive.
Then we'll take it.
Do I consider myself a misfit? Yes.
Time out. One more time. Ladies and gentlemen, Cassie Trentaz, the Misfit. Let's go.
Yes, proudly. Almost always, almost since birth. So it's a little harder to answer the question about, is it intentional?
Gotcha.
It's yes and no.
Okay.
I think in some ways, just how I dropped into the planet and the community that I dropped into, man, I never quite checked off all the boxes or fit into the culturally like set before me categories. And then, you know, as I chose my path, or as my calling kind of unfolded, there was also misfittiness in I was too young in some spaces, or female bodied in other contexts where that wasn't embraced or was contested. But I also have, that never really, I don't seek belonging in that way. Maybe that's because of that in some ways. It hasn't felt like a deterrent at all.
Sure.
And as I've kind of grown into my various misfit identities, I've begun to see it as a gift. There's an edge to it.
Yeah.
There's a power to it. And I've intentionally chosen at times to maintain that. How it shows up for me sometimes is I straddle a lot of communities. So I've got my upbringing in rural, and I've got experience in urban. So the recognition of the urban-rural kind of split that is real in our country. Some of the communities that shape me are more conservative, and some of the communities that I run with are more liberal. And so some of those, like straddling those kinds of dynamics, like I'm an educator, but I'm not a classic educator. I'm a scholar, activist, educator, right? So living kind of in the straddling spaces of different communities, I found has been a gift edge, in that it brings different skills and different lenses, different questions together that haven't always been put together. I've never been quite enough of this, or I'm too much this. Like that's sometimes how it shows up. Right? I'm not enough this. Why can't you be like, you know, blank? Or you're too much this. Like, why can't you tone down that? Right. So that's just the dynamic that I've been aware of like my whole life. And I see it more as, these days I see it more as an opportunity, especially in the kind of moment that we live in, and have begun to try to see, I'm trying this out. Another almost exclusive, right? I've begun to try to see being in trouble as a creation event. So when I get in trouble, which is fairly regular for whatever reason, in whatever situation,
right?
Like, how is being in trouble actually a creation event? What is it that's being troubled? What is it that is like cracking open? What new possibilities does that kind of quaking moment create? And I think, my goodness, I think misfits are the ones that kind of create a trouble, stay with the trouble, and in that, like, new possibilities are birthed that maybe we couldn't think about before that, or our imaginations hadn't gotten there yet. So we've got the troubling, and now our imaginations can see it, can catch up, and maybe it's someone else who can run ahead with it or whatever. But yes, I feel like a misfit. I love that you're doing misfit work. Be a little less alone in some of those spaces in the world. And some of my favorite people in this world, I think, are solidly in the misfit category. and grateful for that good company.
Absolutely. So when we were talking earlier, I was saying to you, one of the, so I want to say I was with you all first. I was in Oregon for a meeting, and then we were able to get some time together. We were talking. I think I was flying to Boston after that and had this late night dinner with some folk at this little pub next to Harvard. And these two conversations, honestly, were deeply deeply charging for kind of what I'm like leaning into. And the portion that I had with you, we're talking, and I'm kind of just, you know me, we're just all my little philosophies, and we're talking about the world and this whole thing. And you hit me with this concept, this theory of change called the two loops theory of change. And you explained it, and when I tell you, my mind exploded. And I went back and I Googled whatever I could find. You know, so this is this, and every conversation, every teaching environment I'm in, anything I'm able to do, I'm always referencing two loops theory of change. This came directly from you to me. I'd never heard of it before. You told me. Explain the theory, and then let's kind of talk a little bit about this concept contextually. So what is the two loops theory of change?
Yeah, very happy to. It's one of my favorite things to talk about these days. And you texted me like a whole string of texts. You're like, where do I find it? What do I read?
Right. What do I read? Where are the books? Where are the articles? Tell me everything.
Where's the books?
Yeah.
I don't know. And I was like, I don't know. I know it experientially.
Yeah.
I know it from the community, right?
Yeah.
This is something that I learned from and with my organizer friends and facilitator friends who are working with communities in the midst of change. But it's the two loops theory of social change. It's usually credited with, I think, the Berkana Institute.
Yes.
Is where I hear it. And really it's a way, there's a visual model. It's kind of a metaphor, a way to map and pay attention to kind of the simultaneous living and dying processes that we're always a part of. So that are a part of any industry, any institution, any organization, often neighborhoods. And this is controversial, but I would say faith tradition.
Absolutely.
And how faith traditions, at least how faith traditions organize themselves, right? So it's a theory that recognizes that change is always happening, that there are always disruptors, or outliers.
Yep.
It's
or
misfits,
right?
always experiments. There are always experiments happening, always people who kind of fit cleanly in and are benefiting from, and those who are not, right, in any of these. And so a way to kind of recognize how these things are moving. So two loops illustrates that in any industry, say for credit higher education, which is mine, or say like the gas-powered automobile, which we're definitely seeing a change. Like there's this moment where this industry becomes dominant, and this is kind of the first loop, right? It works itself up, it's becoming dominant, but then it starts to dip, right? Underneath that, there's always been people who didn't benefit from that, wasn't on board with it, or maybe got it launched, but they're the entrepreneurs. They're like get things launched and they're like, ooh, and they're on to the next thing, right? So there's people like experimenting with other things and like, oh, or visionaries that see 100 years in the future and they're like, this is not sustainable. So what are the things we can start to learn now? So there's always these little bubbling experiments happening here. And these people sometimes find each other. So in the two loops model, it's talking about how the experiments and when those experimenters start to find each other, which I hear you talking a little bit, Geremy, in your own experiences with Misfits right now, right? And they find each other and they begin to practice and share their learnings and might form other communities of practice and get bigger experiments together. And this starts to move up into another loop, right? So there's this moment where these two loops are like right here, where people are making decisions.
Yeah.
For the previously dominant or successful loop or industry or experiment, people are making decisions right here of, are we going to be the stabilizers as it moves down, as we're experiencing loss? Are we going to pour our life into stabilizing this institution or this industry or this organization or this faith tradition? Or are we going to help hospice it and begin to funnel the resources into what we see moving up, right? And there's also this kind of line in the visuals of, sometimes it's called the bridge, sometimes it's called like a wave or something, sometimes it's like just recognizes the transition. And it recognizes both in time, but I see, as an educator, I think about that also just really physically. So a place not just for time and resources to be refunded and reallocated, but I think of myself as an educator as right there with my students at that space, like to help point towards, can we point towards the bridge? What are the skills needed for the bridge? What are the questions needed for that bridge? How do we move that transition, right? So I, in both organizing and educational space, often feel both the possibilities and tension of like being a hospice worker for the dying systems, and those who, you know, helping it have like a dignified death, if possible, right? While also funneling those resources over to help make room to give birth to the things that are emerging, right? So it's like hospice and midwife work at the same time when you live in that bridge piece. And sometimes like blocking out, I feel like I'm blocking out for my students and the new experiments to have a chance to actually grow and get over there and get running. But those are the two loops.
Yeah.
It's happening. If we've worked with communities where we just like lay that out on the floor and say, where would you put yourself on this? Where do you see your church, your community, your organization in terms of just this kind of life cycle? How do we recognize the realities that we're a part of through that as a, in some ways as a metaphor, but also as a little bit of a key. It could be a key, just a lens to try to name without shame the fact that things have cycles, life cycles. So do we feel like, can we feel less shame about a dying industry and instead see the possibilities of how can that be compost to seed what might be useful for the folks coming behind us?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on as it relates to just my energy around this misfit concept in the context of this two-loop theory. Because what I have always felt, before I even had language, was I've always felt like I want to mobilize people. And then I've gotten a passion for mobilizing people that don't fit other places, because those seem to be the people who were dreaming about the future, thinking about what could be, or not necessarily. I was talking with a friend, and he was talking about how he feels like the next generation, his son will probably create the next thing. He said, because I've been saddled with the rules, and the rules sometimes can lock up my imagination. And so as I've kind of just looked at people and experienced, I'm like, yo, you're on to something, and they're on to something, and so are you, and you see it. What if we all got in the same room and developed this community of practice where we just allowed for the synergy that naturally occurs when you have people who are visionary and imaginative, right? It almost like intuitively happens. What if we could mobilize? And what could it look like to then be the engine or those who influence, articulate what's coming next? Because in the two loops theory, we look at things through the lens of it as an organism, right? And every organism has a life cycle. So all the things that we kind of taken for granted, one day they're going to collapse. And when they do, if there's not a population of imagining people who are dreaming about what's next, then, you know, that creates a little bit of a conundrum when it comes to civilization. So I think, you know, to your point, wanting to always be a connector to not only, you know, obviously I think because of my work as a pastor, you know, as my profession, having to transition a really old church into the new world, I kind of had to do this whole bridge thing. But I found more joy and I find joy in that, but I've even found more joy in looking around the world and saying, like, this individual, that individual, like, we need to be in the same room. You need to know so-and-so. Because those are the people that are going to create what's next. And we can take this decomposition with dignity and help fertilize what is now emerging for the future. So it's a really cool construct and concept.
That's right. And Geremy, I'm so grateful for you and what you're naming in terms of like your passion, your commitment to be a connector, because I think that's such a crucial piece of this. I think it's a crucial piece right now.
Sure.
Where we're living, and crucial in those kinds of loop moments of like building that connective tissue.
Yeah.
Like making the connections among folks to see where are the sparks, how does that multiply, or where can resources be creatively used in a way that multiply benefits, or even some decisions can be made because of that, because of the benefit of the more collective and collaborative learning and unlearning.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rather than what you mentioned right just early in the show, what you mentioned about like this, or maybe it was before, I can't remember, but about like the individualist or like the rogue, right? Like that's just not going to work for us. That rogue is like capitalism and white supremacy and all of the things that we're unlearning, right? So the system itself needs to be practiced in a way that just dissolves. That as the hero making that instead of the kind of the anti.
Yeah, I mean, I love it. Misfits love community. You know, Misfits crave community, and I think it fuels us, it energizes, it allows for us. Like, I think we like the ability to sound off, to have things bounce back to us. You know, we know that every idea is not going to be the greatest one, and you kind of need, to be in spaces where you can kind of do that. So in that same conversation, you blew my mind again, because you were like, Geremy, like every 500 years, the world falls apart, and humanity begins to look for the next answer. And I was like, and you started like calling it out. And you talked about Martin Luther. And I mean, you start like calling out over the course of history that there is this cycle. And I was like, wow, I'd never considered that. Talk a little bit, because I think and correct me if I'm wrong, you feel like we're kind of in that space now with the collapsing of certain aspects of culture and this deep desire in humanity to like what's next, but you positioned it by showing how it's happened over the course of a few thousand years. So walk us through that and then talk about what you sense happening right now.
Yeah. We've had some good conversations.
The best. I feel like we deserve a round of applause for our conversation. Please help me celebrate me and Cassie for our conversation.
Well, maybe just, and I feel just like some extra bubbling gratitude for your relationship in my life and your presence in my life that surfaces some of these pieces. This is, again, one of the gifts of being a scholar organizer, right? A scholar activist. So in studying particularly church history, and I was talking almost exclusively just looking at the lens of Christianity. And the history of Christianity. And studying church history and teaching church history I think gives me the benefit of just seeing these patterns. And what I think I was mentioning to you, and this is particularly the movement of like European Christianity and European ways that have given rise to much of what we're experiencing collapsing, and some of the suffering that a lot of communities have experienced underneath these ways. And so just seeing the ways that those dissolve. So because I pointed it out, if we just take the last 2,000 years, the first 500 years, 400 or 500 years, we're dealing with Rome and the Roman Empire. But we know the Roman Empire did not last forever. And so 400 years in, responding to the fall of the Roman Empire and the creation of like what's going to be the new institutions that hold us together. We had some things that kind of stabilized, but now it feels like chaos and crisis. And we see the rise of like monasticism in the Western Christian church as a place to like bring order out of chaos, and experiment with some things for a while. And then around 1000, so 500 years later is when we experience especially like the split between the Eastern and Western branches of the church. We've got the Crusades. And so we're learning to live with significant difference, just culturally, as well as religious orientations, and kind of reorganizing ourselves around who are we going to be? Or are we going to be primarily the people that just pull out the swords? Or are we going to be people who pull out a pen when it comes to engaging folks with different ideas and ways of being in the world and people of faith in the world? And then about 500 years after that is the Reformations, but also colonialism. Right. So we've got in the European continent, the Reformations and the challenge to authority and what becomes like the Protestant movements and the split between Roman Catholic Church and Protestant denominations that ends up in like 2,500 plus Christian denominations now. But also at the same time, colonialism. And so I think that has an even bigger impact of trying to figure out what does it mean to be church? Does it mean to be Christian? What does it mean to be human in the world? And we see it, you know, there's always a really painful period. And then some things start to organize and some new institutions and predominant ways take hold in various places and they rise and then they begin to collapse. Right. And the Reformation and colonialism started around 500 years ago. So here we are in another 500 year. And if we look with those lenses, right, I'm not saying that is like full on truth, right? Because the people in those moments don't necessarily know. But what we know, the folks in those moments know that the things that held the generations together that were before them are no longer holding things together. So whether that's values, whether that's institutions, and we also know that those values and institutions never worked for everyone. They weren't designed for everyone. So there's gains and losses in every collapse, right? And so what we know is, it's like, there was this cartoon I saw with my kids one time where this dog was on a train and it got to like riding a toy train around in this like wild chase scene. And it got to the end of the track and picked up the box of track and it was just like laying down track while the train was going, right? And so it feels, in those moments, it feels a little bit like that because you're in a space where the things that had got you here are not going to work anymore, or they're collapsing, or you might be actively trying to dissolve them or overthrow them. But the things that will then hold the next generations together don't exist yet. So it's this bridge moment in the two loops, or a transition moment, or it's just I call it the in-between. I think we live in an in-between. And that's, I think in the US, we live in an in-between.
Got it.
And I don't know that would be the same. I don't pretend to say that would be the same globally, but in some ways, in some ways, I think because of just global implications and planetary implications, there's also a real in-between moment that we live in that has different kinds of stakes than some of the previous ones. It reminds me of the Detroit-based activist Grace Lee Boggs. She used to ask the question of what time is it on the clock of the world? And that reminds me of that question of what time is it on the clock of the world? I think we're in a moment of collapse. We're in a moment where the things that have held the previous generations together, although never for all of us, are collapsing. We're seeing it. We will experience more of it, which creates challenges, it creates opportunities, it creates choices. And I mean, there's other models too. Margaret Wheatley talks about like every collapsing empire follows the same pattern, like just looking at global things that would like grew to empire kind of status,
Mm-hmm.
like, and what are the stages? And if we read that as a lens, it also spells to the same kinds of things. Like,
Yeah.
oh, we can see that. So the question is not where are we all the time. The question is, okay, so who do we want to be?
Yes.
Or what's that world we're dreaming about? And what are the skills and tools that we know we need, that we've used, that our ancestors have used, and or that we need to develop now for this moment, that kind of bring us from, and this is the organizer work, the world as we experience it, to that world that we dream about and are beginning to imagine.
So good. So the obvious next question, maybe as a counterbalance to what you just answered, is then where do we see the bottom loop? Like where now I'm talking about you specifically, when you look around the country in whatever spaces you're engaging, where do you see the thinkers, the influencers, the doers, the people that excite you, that are kind of percolating in this moment of shift, that could be the ones who are helping to articulate or steward like where we're headed next?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really important question. A lot of the folks that I see that I get excited about are just really, really localized.
Yeah.
So rather, like, it's a move from globalized to the incredibly localized.
Sure.
And
please call those names too. I mean, we'd love to hear any names that are local to you that might be worth, you know what I'm saying, just knowing and hearing.
Yeah. And some of the folks that are offering theory would be folks like, well, not just theory. It's never just theory.
Sure.
So the folks that are offering some reflections on the practice that are more widely available would be like Emergent Strategy folks like Adrienne Marie Brown and some of her community. Bayo Akumalefe is a person that I follow his thinking. And like Tricia Hersey from the NAP ministry, I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, but I see all of these folks as, and a transnational community that I've been a part of for several years, and just like spiritual and theological mutual accompaniment, where it's people from US and Mexico, Peru. That's how we started. Now we have some Brazil, we have some Spain, mostly Spanish speaking, and US folks who are practicing what it looks like to reflect and hone our practices, people at the intersections of kind of life and death, faith and justice, in particular communities. But I see these folks, all of these folks, as in some ways practicing kind of recovery. This is recovery, and I don't mean like grabbing things, but I mean personal recovery.
Yeah.
Like in recovery from systems, even while, so this is that middle moment, having to pay the bills.
Yeah, right.
So in recovery from systems, even while still in them at times. So reclaiming embodiment, reclaiming locality and joy.
Yeah.
That's a huge piece, and fierceness and playfulness. There's like trickster sensibilities around it, which like just makes my heart go thump thump. My trickster self goes thump thump.
Yeah.
So it's that in and out of systems and modeling what we talked about a little bit earlier, the ways that the inness and the outness kind of erode the system itself and makes way for the new ways. So I see these folks as doing what feels like soil work for the in-between times. So making those new ways possible.
I love it.
I see it in the immigration justice community. I see it in the interfaith community in Portland. In my own local context, I see it in conversations with my students.
Yeah.
Like naming some of my students who are scrapping and are dissatisfied. And I just want to like stoke some of that restlessness. But at the same time, like be kind of a home place, landing place. Because I know that restlessness alone will eat you up.
Yeah.
So it's both fuel and then also creating a little bit of that buffer place to come and rest. Dying industries will kill you.
Yeah.
if you let them.
Yeah.
Like we say to each other, don't die for a dying industry.
Yeah.
Don't die for a thing that's dying. And those things don't love you back. So
Yep.
what does it look like to love each other and ourselves in a way?
I love it. All right, here's our final question.
Yeah.
And this is the misfit question I ask every single guest, and so I'm gonna hit you with it. So Sergey Brin has a quote, and the quote is, and I'm saying my version of his quote. So the quote is, unless what you're doing sounds to some like science fiction, it's not transformational enough. So my question for you is, what is that sci-fi thing, the thing that sounds silly until it happens? Like whether that's something that you are initiating or involved in, or even something that you hear or see around you. What is that crazy thing that, like, when people hear it, they're like, okay, you're nuts. It's never going to happen. That's impossible. Until it happens.
I feel like I have a string of proposals that I've been permitting that always are told that I'm nuts.
I love it.
The sci-fi question, I bristle at the sci-fi.
You wait, say it again?
I bristle a little bit at the sci-fi.
Okay.
Not as a critique of the quote, but sometimes when I think about science fiction, it's like the images that come to mind that have been kind of like painted for me are like shiny and electric and technological.
Sure.
And man, when I think of the future, I'm thinking more of what we sometimes associate with ruins. So like when like the green and the vines start to overtake the things that we thought we could build up and would keep us safe or would, make us powerful. And so when I think of the future, it's like away from the overbuilt and more towards the intuitive, where humans are like what we talked about a little bit in this last few minutes of nurturing our ability to work and move in tandem.
Yeah.
Where we can move like flocks.
Yeah.
Like Adrienne Marie Brown talks about murmurations.
Yes.
And how birds like are in touch with the seven around them. So my sci-fi is like humans actually get in touch with some of those abilities that we have and can move more in tandem and more intuitive, more instinctual work with the seven next to them are like so grounded in local community, but the local community touches a community next to it, right? And touches the community next to it. So how are these moving in ways that are benefiting the whole? And I think because I am so interested in bold ideas is why I spend a lot of my time right now in that bridge.
Yeah.
Like, I think I've had seasons and will have seasons where I'll be the experimenter. And right now I'm in a season where I'm being called to nurture the bridge.
Yeah.
To translate, to get quick learnings, to translate kind of the crumbling of current systems into soil for the seeding for the next thing. That maybe I won't see the thing that replaces what's collapsing. But like when I think about higher education, I'm always experimenting and drafting proposals that are more contextually and communally responsive models. Away from credit-based, away from tuition-based. So it's just looks very different than what has held the folks and what like most are operating with right now. But I think we're in a moment where education itself also has to adapt and find its next evolution away from kind of institutional in the same kinds of way and more as like being the educational partners to the other good work in cities or in regions or in neighborhoods, which looks like death to some, right? And it looks like death at first. but actually maybe is compost.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And the ability to kind of like lift up the hidden prayers and the deep longings and possibilities of the folks right there in that space, and educate for the now and around the corner, rather than as like a stable institution that is like a gatekeeper of a different future that we've a little bit experienced.
That sounds exciting. That's an amazing world for us to live in. It's almost, the future really is going back, you know, because so much has gotten us away from each other, gotten us away from ourselves, and that intuitive nature in which you talk about, it gets lost when the complexity of all of these new additives, AI, technology, all things, wonderful things. I'm using an iPad right now.
Sure.
We're on Zoom right now. Like, I'm not trying to like be disingenuous, but if it's not counterbalanced by your capacity to be present with yourself and present with the next person, there is something about the energy, the pheromones, all these things that do matter, or unless God wouldn't have created them. There's a power in that. And I almost feel like, you know, what you're advocating for is for, in our pursuits, us not to lose what's worth pursuing great things for. Because if we don't have each other, then what does it all mean, right?
Yeah, and what kind of ancestors do we want to be? Like,
Yeah.
what, like, I often think about, like, you know, my kids' generation, my grandkids' generation, like out there. Like,
Yeah.
When we're looking, when the vision is long, what do they need? So here, I can't articulate all of that, but I can see a bit of the horizon.
Yeah.
Right. So what do they need from me now in order to kind of create the conditions so that those things might be possible for them?
Cassie, you have been an absolutely phenomenal guest. Thank you so much for joining me today. This has been great. I can't thank you enough, buddy.
Geremy, I'm so grateful for you in my life.
Absolutely.
And so grateful that you're exploring the misfits in the world.
Thank you so much for listening to the Misfit Manifesto. I trust this has been as, you know, impactful for you as it has been for me. Now, what makes these type of moments in this community special is when you're a part of it. So I want to encourage you to go to misfitmanifesto.com, join the conversation, and join the community. I believe something is on the horizon, but I don't want to do it alone. I want to do it with you. So come be a part, and let's see some amazing things happen.